We should be online now.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We apologize. We were having some technical difficulties, but thank you for staying on and hanging in with us today. Welcome to this afternoon's panel, The Urgency of Now, Perspectives from the Humanities on the Capitol Riots. This panel is the second in a series called The Urgency of Now, initiated by the law school in January, when it hosted a panel called The Fierce Urgency of Now, the Role of Dissent, which focused on the Capitol Riots and free speech through the lens of racial justice. I'm Amy Randall, Professor of History and Chair of the History Department, as well as the Associate Director for the Center for Arts and Humanities. I'll be moderating the discussion today. Michelle Burnham, the Director for the Center for Arts and Humanities, and I thank you for joining our conversation this afternoon. The phrase, the urgency of now, is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's usually associated with his I Have a Dream speech, which he delivered at the summer of 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. In this speech, he talked about the fierce urgency of now to make real the promises of democracy. He cautioned against cooling off or proceeding gradually in pursuit of this goal, arguing, quote, "It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment." End quote. Not as well known is how he used it in another context, a speech called Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence in 1967. In this speech, Dr. King explained, "We can no longer afford to worship the God of hate or bow before the altar of retaliation. The oceans of history are made turbulent by the ever rising tides of hate. History is cluttered with the wreckage of nations and individuals that pursued the self-defeating path of hate. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked, and dejected with a lost opportunity. We still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. We must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace and justice throughout the world. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight." I share Dr. King's words with you because I think they have relevance to us in our current political context. Although Joe Biden won the election and is now the president, the turbulence of the rising tides of hate in this country and the threat of anti-democratic and anti-government white supremacists remain with us. The Capitol riots underscore this reality, as does the proliferation of anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, anti-Latinx, anti-Asian, and anti-Muslim discourses and attacks. I would like to suggest to you today, in the words of Dr. King, that we cannot overlook the urgency of the moment, and we must act now to protect our fragile and imperfect multiracial democracy. It is likely that anti-government and extremist threats will grow even worse in the months ahead. The urgency of now is real. So I wanted to give you that context for our conversation. Today, we have three amazing professors who are going to share their insights with us. And I'm going to introduce them first, and then we'll go into some questions that I have for them. Juan Velasco is an associate professor in the Department of English at Santa Clara University. He teaches courses in creative writing and Latinx literature. Dr. Velasco has published many works, including a novel, a collection of poetry, a memoir, numerous academic articles, 2 academic books, including most recently, Cultural Resistance and Collective Identity in Contemporary Chicano Autobiography by Palgrave Macmillan. And 1988, New York, LA, a memoir by Editorial Polibea in Spain. In addition, his short stories and poetry have been published in multiple venues around the world. Dr. Velasco is currently hosting a blog, Right Here, Right Now, that provides insights on writing and personal growth, And the act of writing, in his words, is a deeply connected with the act of sharing, healing, and social justice around the world. And this has informed his decision to create the NGO Programa Velasco in 2007, whose mission is to promote education and economic empowerment for children and women in El Salvador. Sonia Gomez is a first-generation college graduate and assistant professor of history at Santa Clara University. Before joining the faculty at Santa Clara this year, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard University. Dr. Gomez specializes in 20th century US history with a focus on comparative race and ethnic relations, migration and diaspora, and social movement history. One of her articles, Yankee, Why Does a Big Man Like You Fear My Baby? The Politics of the Anti-Japanese Movement, 1908 to 1924, was just published in December in the journal Emerasia in a special issue on rethinking gendered citizenship, intimacy, sovereignty, and empire. Her forthcoming book, A Gendered Diaspora, Intimacy and Empire in the Making of Japanese America, 1908 to 1952, is under contract with New York University Press. Daniel Turkeltaub is an associate professor and the chair of classics at SCU. And as a chair, we have commiserated together, I must admit. At Santa Clara University, he teaches an array of Greek and Latin language and culture courses, including a course on the origins of jury trials in ancient Greece, and a course on how the nature of laughter shaped comedy's development in ancient Greece and Rome. He has published several articles on the religious significance of ancient Greek epic poetry and drama, on the capabilities of oral epic poetry to communicate meaning beyond their mere words, and on humor in epic and its effects on audiences. Recently, his research interests have shifted to questions about how performances of Athenian tragedies provided Athenian citizens with a communal state-run forum for scrutinizing their own democracy and examining the nature of responsible citizenship within democratic states. So welcome to all of our panelists today. And I want to start off our interdisciplinary conversation with a personal question. I'd like to start with you, Dr. Velasco, but this question is for all three of you. So how have your identities and life experiences contributed to your response to recent events, both the January 6 riots, but also other political developments?
Thank you, Amy. January 6, for those of you who know a little bit about Catholic liturgy is Epiphany. And as you probably know, in countries in Latin America and Spain and other Catholic countries like the Philippines, Epiphany is also called Reyes Magos, the three wise men. That day I was actually sharing a video call with my family because it's the traditional day when children are receiving the gifts. In the same way, here in the US, we give the gifts the 25th of December. And it was very interesting to see the reaction of my family, who were all gathering together to give the gifts to each other. And I was present in there just to witness the celebration. It was very interesting to see their reaction. It was really horrifying. The images were being played all over the world. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was very scary, of course. And in my family, it had special painful memories associated with it because they lived the Spanish Civil War. This is 1936, 1939, that era. That is still an open wound in many people, for many people in Spain. And, but particularly in my family, my uncles were incarcerated. They were fighting in the side of the Republic. So there was tremendous repression and destruction within my family. It was clearly a very painful, scary moment to see that. There was a resonance. And I just tried to calm them down that here in California, we were doing okay. And we didn't see anything scary in the streets. But the more I watched the images, I also had a little bit of PTSD myself. I remembered in 1981, that was in my last year of high school and starting my first year at the university in Madrid, there was a coup d'etat. Those years were called the years of transition. We were leaving the dictatorship. I grew up under Francisco Franco's dictatorship. We were living those years, and as we were moving closer and closer to democracy, a group of people took Congress, and they started shooting, and there was some killings, if I remember correctly. And I remember exactly the day it happened because I was in my English class. I was thinking I wasn't going to get a good grade in English, and now here I am, so many years later. But what I remember very clearly is how our teacher left the classroom, and she took a long, long time to come back. And when she came back, she looked pale. She was crying, and she said, "You know, the army is in the streets. You need to go home because this is going to be very dangerous and very difficult." So for me, January 6th was really painful. It really touched experiences in my family that I never really totally healed. And I experienced some PTSD myself, remembering those years of the transition. And even I remember being on the streets, and some students were killed during those years. So it was a difficult time for me. And I can explain later what did I decide to do with that.
Okay, thank you so much, Juan. Sonia Gomez, Dr. Sonia Gomez, could you provide us with a little bit perspective from your own experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that one. So January 6th, as many of you know, was the first week of the winter quarter. It was the second day of classes for me this week, or this quarter. And I have to say, my initial reaction was of anger. I think that anger is a kind of taboo subject in a lot of spaces, particularly when we're thinking about politics. But I was angry when I saw what was happening, primarily, I mean, for a variety of reasons, but one that was really stuck with me, and for a lot of people, was the anger at seeing such kind of bold, seemingly fearless takeover of the Capitol. And those of us who participated in Black Lives Matter protests the summer before, and those of us who have been a part of different protest movements, were just kind of utterly shocked. And just, we know, I'm a US historian, so I like to joke that we're kind of pessimists in a lot of ways. I mean, but it was still shocking to see, and it really upset me and angered me in a lot of ways. I remember when I was an undergrad at Berkeley, and we were protesting the student fee hikes, and students at UC Berkeley and UC Davis were treated much more terrible. They were pepper sprayed and hit with batons. So I was really in shock that we didn't see that strong police presence and that repressive force. So in addition to being angry, and to be honest, I'm still angry when I think about it. But the other thing is fear. I remember hearing the reports that a woman had been shot, and my first reaction was like, oh my God, I need to go check AOC's Twitter. And she hadn't tweeted in a while, and it really frightened a lot of people, at least in my circle, because she's been, those who follow her career, has been the victim of such hateful, sexist, racist remarks. And so at one point throughout the day, I had is this really happening? Am I really fearful that one of our representatives, our first Latina, the youngest, could be a victim of a hate crime? It wasn't her. I mean, it wasn't her, thankfully, and she's talked about it very openly on Instagram, why she wasn't tweeting that day, for her safety. She didn't want to leave any clues to where she was, but that very real and kind of present danger really stuck with me. And it was a fear that I hadn't felt, at least in my adult life, when it came to politics. So anger and fear are the two, I think, very intense feelings and emotions that overtook me on January 6th and still sit with me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sonia, for those comments. Daniel, what about you?
Yeah, my reaction on January 6th began with the realization that I'm in a position of privilege, being a white middle-class man from a family that is well educated. I was outraged, but I also realized that these events did not threaten me personally in the way I recognized they did other people, not as immediately at least. And I also didn't have the personal experiences of oppression and violence to be able to connect with that. And so that gave me an emotional cushion. And I felt numb, is how I felt when I saw these things happen. And it all seemed to me very familiar, not from personal experience or life experience, but looking at events that have happened in history in other countries, or even in ancient Greece in Athens with democracy in the early days in the 5th century. And those were the connections I drew. So I became almost numb and analytic in my response, but I had the luxury of doing that. If you call it, I had the luxury of doing that because my first realization was, yeah, I'm in a position of privilege here. And that was sort of how I reacted.
Thank you so much, Dan. I think it's really important, the different types of responses that people had, to acknowledge the legitimacy of all of the responses, and that, the fear and anger that Sonia felt and, could be accompanied by numbness on the part of Dan's response. And numbness is often a coping mechanism to fear and anger, right? And I'm also interested, Juan, in what you had to say in particular about how the events of your past shaped how you were seeing what was unfolding, but that also living in that past of a coup and being a student, being told to go home because the military, had occupied the streets. You hinted at that it had led you to make certain decisions, and I don't know if this is related to the next set of questions that I have, but and maybe decisions that you made about your life course. But I wanted to move on and just have you reflect a little bit on how your academic expertise informed your understanding of the January 6th Capitol riots and the violent efforts to delegitimize our democratic system. What lessons about politics in the US today can be drawn from your research and teaching, but again, also going back to the personal?
Yeah, this is something that I didn't realize at the time. It was definitely traumatic, 1981, and all those years of transition. And I was very active in high school and those first couple of years at the university, and in fighting for and the student movement, pro-democracy movement in Spain. Something moved me to leave Spain, and I became a Latin American studies expert and Latinx literature. And I was very involved with the movements in Central America and in Mexico. And that's where I found a new community, home, safety, even though sometimes we think of Latin America as this place of turmoil and difficulty. But for me, it was actually a way of creating a different kind of community that was not associated with a lot of the trauma that I have experienced and the trauma that my family had experienced. Some of my cousins decided otherwise, and they stayed in Spain, and they become involved in political movements, and they still are today. But I basically went to Latin America, fell in love with it, and never looked back. And but then something else happened, right? Like, you cannot escape your karma. These things will always follow you everywhere. So here we are in this is the early 1980s. And then in 1989, we had the massacre of the Jesuits in El Salvador. And that really awakened again those memories, and also the analysis. This is why academically I have always been very interested on authoritarianism and moments of, my book is called Collective Identity and Cultural Resistance, because what do you do in moments like that? The massacre of the Jesuits touched me very deeply because I knew El Salvador very well, and some of my family have also been involved in Central America, and also because I noticed, theology of liberation was doing something completely different to what I witnessed in Franco's Spain and post-Franco Spain. And let me clarify this. If you look into history books, you usually see Francisco Franco next to Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, and you have this idea of, fascism of the 1930s. My theory is that Franco was never a fascist. What he was able to gather in Spain was this group of white Christian nationalists that gathered around him in order to save Spain, or to make Spain better again. And the dream was going back to 1492, the Catholic kings uniting under one religion, one language, one culture, one land. And of course, the multicultural, multilingual, multiracial Spain was completely crashed for 500 years. It was very interesting for me to be in the 1980s and 1990s involved in Latin America and noticing these authoritarian movements again. And in Argentina and in Chile, there were clear connections with, neo-Nazis moving there and doing all kinds of things. But what I found especially in Central America and El Salvador, was also this kind of like white Christian nationalism that was trying to save the country from communism. And of course, on the other side, you have theology of liberation with Monsignor Romero, who was able to provide a different way of understanding what the country is all about, what faith was all about, what unity was all about. Academically, I'm very interested on this because I was just thinking recently to what happened in the Capitol with the riots. I wonder, this in a way, this movement that Trump has launched and that I see in Europe and in Latin America is probably more dangerous than fascism, because fascism, it's kind of easy to dismiss. But to the middle classes, when they feel in crisis, this sort of like ideology of unity around white Christian nationalism is very appealing. And you see that in Brazil, in Latin America, you see that in France, in Europe. And I think you're going to see that gathering some strength and some energy as long as a certain group of people feel economically or politically defranchised and separated from the center of power. So academically, I've been very interested on studying this notion of white Christian nationalism and how does it work in Europe and Latin America. And I'll share more later, but I started going full circle. I started a new project about the Spanish Civil War and doing some writing around that.
Okay. Thank you. I definitely want to hear more about that project. It sounds fascinating. Sonia Gomez, professor, how about your academic expertise? How does it inform your understanding of the riots, and what have you been thinking about given your research and your teaching interests?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I feel, I guess I'll speak for myself. As a US historian, I think a lot of times I can, come off as a pessimist. Because when you look at, I focus on race relations, migration, and social movements. And so much of what I look at is entangled with these movements of white backlash. And for me, to make sense of what I'm seeing, what I saw in the Trump's presidency and January 6th was white backlash to, we had our first Black president, President Obama. And so I think some of that brings me comfort because I can point to examples in history. I can point to the white backlash after Reconstruction. You can point, there's many instances, in US history that would tell us that this was likely going to happen. Someone like Trump could, rise to power in a post-Obama era. So that kind of predictability, I think, brings some comfort in some ways because the history of race relations in this country tends to ebb and flow. For every small step forward we take, it seems we take 50 steps backwards in the next era, and that's very much what the Trump's presidency felt like. And then so part of it feels, predictable. And I would hear, also social media and like having conversations, people say things like, this isn't America, this is not us. And as a US historian, I'm like, yeah, it is. This is very much us. But at the same time, in my lifetime, and for those who are around my age and younger, this was also in a lot of ways unprecedented. We hadn't seen something like this, witnessed it live as it was happening. And people were tweeting and sharing TikToks and videos, and so the way that it happened and that it happened in our lives, I think was jarring in a lot of ways. The last, or I guess the only kind of successful coup happened in 1898 during Reconstruction. And that was a coup very much about race at its core. And I don't think anybody from that period is alive today. So I think it was unprecedented in our lifetimes, but at the same time, it was also, it felt predictable. This was white supremacy on full display, both Trump's presidency and what happened on January 6th. So I kind of teeter in between both. As a historian, I'm like, this has happened before. As a person, I'm like, wow, what is going on? So these are two kind of different tensions that I'm kind of feeling as a historian.
Thank you, Sonia. Very interesting comments, and again, maybe we'll circle back to some of them. Professor Turkeltaub, Danielle.
Yeah, with my academic expertise here, my responses, my reactions align with both Juan and Sonia's. That on the one hand, and this is part of the numbness I felt, that it does seem so familiar. Thucydides, when he's describing 5th century Athens, the Peloponnesian War, and some of the experiences that some of the city-states, the polis, were going through, he describes events that are, you change a word here or there, and they would you could almost publish them as news articles about what happened on January 6th. It's so close, and about the buildup to what happened on January 6th. Some of the specific triggers change, but the fundamental principles, dynamics of people being threatened, as Juan was talking about, and finding recourse, finding their own hope or truth in ideological extremism and then acting violently based on that ideological extremism. It's back in the Greek literature from the very beginning of Athenian democracy. It's there. And so on the one hand, it felt very familiar and defied the notion, as Sonia was talking about, that America is in any way exceptional in that respect, that we are just like every other democracy and every other country that currently exists or that has exists. Democracy is operating by its principles. And I think that the particular nature of our democracy, the fact that we have a representational democracy may have slowed some of this down, but I also think pessimistically it's going to make it even more difficult to try to recover from it because some of those power bases are entrenched. And so whereas I'm thinking back to the Athenians, for them, it was a direct democratic system. And so it had the dynamism that the flexibility to respond instantly to things that we have actually built in our system deliberately not to have, to prevent things like this from happening. But then when they do happen, how do we extricate ourselves? And so I also am in lockstep with Sonia and Juan with the pessimism here. And that despair is part of the numbness, as looking for a hopeful outcome for this, a way forward to healing. And it's hard to see.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think, we've touched on some really interesting ideas and topics already, and I'm sort of hesitant to move into another question because I feel like there's so much richness here that we could still talk about. So I kind of wanted to give actually the three of you an opportunity to respond to each other's comments or to ask each other a question before we talk about a third question, just because I think there's so much richness here.
Maybe I can respond to this idea of whether or not we should be pessimist. I tend to be an optimist, so I'll just give it a try. But so I was thinking what had happened since January, and I wanted to share with you one of the books I was reading in the fall that I've found very interesting and very healing for me. It's an academic book, but I needed to go back to that time. This is the book I was reading in the fall, The Letters of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade from the Spanish Civil War. And it's so you can tell, 624 pages of letters of the volunteers, the Americans who volunteer to go to Spain to fight fascism. And it's very moving because what you see in these letters is students, workers, teachers, nurses, artists of all kinds. These volunteers were people who very generously believed in democracy and equality, and they thought Madrid was the place to go to stop fascism in Europe. And they were right. They thought if we lose the war in Spain, we're going to have a World War II. And they were right. That's exactly what happened. But they were pioneers. And this book was, for me, it's just like really it's just a way of reconnecting with what I believe we can be as Americans. We have a lot to offer. While reading these letters from Cuban Americans, Asian Americans, I discovered, everybody was there. Everybody who believed in democracy and the ideals of saving Spain. I discovered too many letters of writers I've been reading this book as well, Spain in Our Hearts, and I realized that this was a war that was fought by intellectuals, and this is like people who have never had a gun in their lives, and they were right there on the front fighting the fascism in Europe, and it was full of poets and people who have never thought they will have to be in the streets. I recommend this book. It's really moving, and Hochschild is one of the best historians. He really makes the world look alive in front of your eyes. But this is what I discovered, and I'm very excited about this. I discovered the presence of the African Americans, a lot of men who became heroes. But I've been fascinated by the story of Salaria Key. She was the only African American nurse who was part of the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, and her story is fascinating. She was Catholic. She was told that she was not allowed to join the Red Cross because of the color of her skin. So she went undocumented anyway. She went to Paris. From Paris, she crossed the Pyrenees with the help of the resistance. She went to Madrid, and her life is truly fascinating. I'm thinking about writing a script or maybe a historical novel because her life is just incredible. And here you have some pictures of the African Americans who saw in this anti-fascist war that was happening in Spain. They saw it as part of the resistance. A lot of people don't know who Salaria Key is, but she was very famous in Spain. She was in all the films, and she's still in some murals in the streets. This red star is the symbol of the Lincoln Brigade. And what is interesting about her life as well, she was breaking all kind of barriers, right? And she was part of a mixed marriage. She married this Irish socialist who was also there in Spain fighting for the Republic. When it was her time to return to the US, they were not allowed to return together because mixed marriages were not allowed in the US. So she wrote a personal letter to the president asking for permission for her husband to return to the US. There is a lot of dimensions about her life that is truly interesting. And she wrote a pamphlet where she was describing her adventures as an African-American nurse in Republican Spain. And when she returned to the US, what is interesting is she was part of the civil rights movement. And then later on, she was also involved with the Central American Revolutionary Wars. And I just want to plug in this event. In 2 days, Sunday, there is a free film that you can watch online. It's called Invisible Heroes, African Americans in the Spanish Civil War. You can just register in ALBA, and ALBA is the association of the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. They're still very active, even though most of them are already old, but they never forgot the lessons. So I just wanted to share a little bit with you, a little bit of what I'm doing now. This is what I'm doing. I'm really excited about this project because I really believe that we have to get involved. And, and there are many different ways of getting involved, whether you're a nurse or a teacher or a writer or a worker or, businessman. There are moments in history when you just have to be there and do whatever you can. And Americans, especially the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, is a great example of what can be done. Those people were real heroes. So I think we have reasons to be optimistic, but we also have to be realistic and work really hard because it's never going to be easy.
Thank you so much. I think, part of what you're speaking to is in this example of the Spanish Civil War and the Abraham Lincoln Brigade is the power of solidarity and coalitions in fighting back in resistance and taking a stand against fascism or against other forms of violence. And the importance of that now, the urgency of now for us to be doing that, right? And to be doing that, whether we're doing that in the streets or as politicians or as academics in the classroom, as teachers, or as poets, as writers, all of these different ways. We are running out of time, unfortunately. So I wanted to I think I'll ask this question and then maybe Sonia or Dan, if you'd like to answer, Juan, but also open it up to people who have questions who are watching right now. Speaking of, the poets and the writers who are involved in the Spanish Civil War, who are taking up arms, it's really important for us to sort of think about how the humanities, I think, can help us to better understand the January 6th events and the urgency of now, to better understand, but also to better cope with, right? To seek solace. And so I'm just, I'm curious what you think about how the humanities can help us think that way. Perhaps Sonia and then Dan, you can start, and then Juan maybe jump in, and any outside questions if they're connected.
Yeah, that was the hardest question that I was kind of mulling over in my mind. History is sometimes considered social science, a humanistic social science, sometimes in the humanities field. And so I'm kind of speaking from that perspective. And I alluded to this earlier in one of my responses that as far as history and studying history and having a knowledge and appreciation for the past, I think it gives people the ability to think in the long view, right? Ability to look back and say, this has happened before, these things were different.
Mm-hmm.
To not that we can predict the future, but to move ahead, I think there needs to be some realistic kind of problem solving and having that kind of historical lens. This is what I tell my students all the time, can really help you be a better problem solver in the now. So we need more people to study history. We need more historians in public office so that they can not have that historical amnesia and hopefully learn from the past. I mean, this is something that gets repeated all the time. History is repeating itself. We're not learning from the past. And I think that is because we do have a historical amnesia. We tend to want to forget the things that happened in the past. We tend to want to forget the bad things that happened in the past. And so, and to our own detriment, because then we're not learning and we're not figuring out why certain actions, why certain policies, why certain movements failed, and how we can overcome that, or how we can use we can use history, lessons of history to kind of approach our problems now. So that's just kind of one thought I had. Thinking about the humanities, particularly history, and the urgency of now.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Dan.
I think that one of the core problems here is that the people involved in the attacks on the Capitol on January 6th have a different reality. They're operating in a different reality in that they are completely convinced that they are champions of democracy and that the election was stolen and that everybody else are the oppressors, and that they are the Democrats. They are the ones who are standing up for democracy and the champions of freedom and the vote, and that they don't think the election was, well, they think it was rigged, and that the vote actually went to Trump. Now, that I think is a fundamental problem, that this notion of existing in different realities with different truths and operating based on that. And I think that what we need to do, I think the answer, if there is an answer, is to go through education. Mention the humanities. I think that that one thing that could help if there's anything that can help, is to bolster, support, and make a central core part of every curriculum at the college level, at the high school level, at the middle school level, at the elementary level, the study of literature, cultural studies, and foreign language. The idea here being that when we read literature, when we study other cultures, when we learn foreign languages, we learn that other people think in different ways. And moreover, not only do they think in different ways, but they have legitimate, responsible, rational, respectable views of how the world works and of humanity's position in the world and the way people interact with each other and the basic principles and values we have. They have different conceptions of these things, and they're not bad or wrong. They're responsible and rational ways of viewing the world. And if we can come to appreciate that in each other more and realize that just because there's a difference, that doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong or bad or is oppressive. We can, I hope, start to break down this notion of alternate realities being so adversarial. I don't think we can ever get rid of the notion of alternate realities, that people just view the world differently and have different truths for themselves. But perhaps the hostility between them can be broken down. But I think it comes through the study of humanities and literature, cultural studies programs, foreign language. And it would be, the problem is, of course, that the educational programs are controlled by corporations and government entities who benefit, I think, from the de-emphasis of literature and cultural studies programs. And so it's an uphill fight to reform education so that maybe decades down the line, something may change. But that's, I think humanities is the answer. I think it's absolutely essential. And I realize I'm biased when I say that, being a humanist myself. That's part of it.
Well, I tend to agree that history and literature and different languages and cultural studies, all of this helps us to understand other people better, to develop cultural competency and empathy. And so, yes, very important, I think. Juan, what about you? Any thoughts?
I think the future is our students, and that's where we're going to be able to build something bigger and better and more able to deal with this global village we're living in. Our students naturally understand that. Yeah, there's going to be small groups that will be resisting change, demographic change, cultural change. But I think it's inevitable. We are already a multiracial, multilingual, multicultural society, and we are strong precisely because of that. That's why we are strong. And most of the other countries around the world, they try to follow the model of California because they know that's the model of the future. So what we have to do is to provide the tools for people to understand that the future is here and now, that we are already in the 21st century. There's going to be some small little moments of nostalgia, trying to take us back to a 1950s that never existed. But for the most part, I think the role of the university and the humanities is going to be to educate everybody on what the future is and how we can be better and how can we build a better world, precisely because we understand what the planet is all about. This has to be a sort of like, this is a wake-up call for us as well, to understand that we are not alone in this. We're not the first country to be top #1 and then having some issues and coming down to second or third position. Whatever it is that people are worried about, history definitely is teaching us that lesson. But the university is not fake news. The university is the information that has been created throughout decades of research and writing and discussing. And once our students understand that the tools are there, they're going to be able to use them and build a better world.
Thank you so much for, it seems these are just wonderful closing comments, I have to say, and we are at the 5 o'clock mark. I do want to apologize because a couple of audience members did have some questions that were related to earlier comments, and I didn't want to draw away from this particular line of inquiry that we were pursuing. But thank you all for your insights, your expertise, your personal stories. It was very interesting to talk with you today, and move forward. Let's move forward together collectively in solidarity. And thank you for everybody who is watching today. And I'm going to volunteer this, hoping that it's okay with the three of you. But if you have any particular questions for our three panelists today, please reach out to them. The emails are available on the SCU website. So thank you, everybody. The urgency of now. We will continue to have this conversation, but thank you for your insights today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, baby.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Juan.
Thank you.
Are we off?